There are certain letters, I have found, that carry their own atmosphere. A love letter smells faintly of something hopeful. Ink and recklessness. A letter of dismissal has about it the dry, papery finality of autumn leaves. But a letter from the dead, and I speak now from experience, for I have received precisely one in my lifetime. A letter from the dead arrives wrapped in something colder than winter, something that presses against the skin of the throat and does not warm. It was a November morning in 1936, and I had come down to breakfast at Whitehaven Mansions to find Poirot already at the table, his egg precisely decapitated, his toast soldiers marshalled in formation. He was, however, not eating. He was staring at a letter in his hand, with an expression I'd seen perhaps 3 times in all our years of association. An expression of genuine astonishment. "Hastings," he said without looking up. "Sit down. Do not pour your coffee. You will spill it." "Nonsense. I've poured coffee thousands of—" "Sit down." I sat. There was a quality in his voice that bypassed argument. "I have received this morning a most extraordinary communication." He held up the letter. Heavy cream paper, the sort one associates with old money and older obligations. "It is from the Countess Irina Dobrynyna." The name was familiar, though I could not immediately place it. Dobrynyna, Russian by birth, married to Count Pyotr Dobrynin, who owned estates in the Crimea before the Revolution. They fled to Paris in 1918 with what remained of the family jewels, considerably more than most émigrés managed. The Count died in 1929. The Countess has lived since then in a manor house in the Chilterns called Blackthorn Hall. A woman of immense wealth, formidable will, and, it appears, considerable foresight. Foresight. Because, mon ami, the Countess Irina Dobrynyna died 4 days ago. She was buried yesterday. And this letter— He held it up between thumb and forefinger, as one might hold a thing that bites— was posted the day before her death, with instructions that it should be delivered to me this morning, after the funeral. I stared. "She wrote to you knowing she was going to die. She wrote to me, Hastings, knowing she was going to be murdered." He passed me the letter. The handwriting was strong, upright, with a continental flourish to the capitals. The hand of a woman educated before the century turned. I read, "Dear Monsieur Poirot, if you receive this letter, I am dead. I do not write this as a dramatic gesture. I am too old and too Russian for such things. I write it as a matter of fact, in the same spirit as one writes a will or instructions for the disposal of one's furs. I have been poisoned. I do not know the precise agent, but I know the hand that administers it. The doses have been small, incremental, spread across weeks. My physician, Dr. Morden, attributes my decline to age and a weak heart. He is wrong, though I do not blame him. The symptoms are identical. But I know my own body, monsieur, as I know my own house. Something foreign has entered both. I have not gone to the police because the person who is killing me is someone I love, and because the reason they are killing me is something I cannot expose without destroying what remains of my family. I'm not asking you to save my life. That is beyond saving. I'm asking you to attend my funeral, to observe what happens afterward, and to ensure that when the coffin is opened, as it must be, the truth is revealed before anyone else is harmed. There is a key sewn into the lining of my coffin. It opens the strong box beneath the floorboards of my study. In that box you will find everything. Come to Blackthorn Hall. Come after the burial. Come when the mourners have dried their tears and begun to count the silver. With the highest regard, Irina Dobrynyna, I set down the letter. My coffee sat untouched, and Poirot, for once, did not remark upon it. She asks you to open the coffin, I said. She asks me to ensure it is opened. There is a difference. The first is an action. The second is a campaign. But Poirot, if she's been buried, then the key is buried with her, and whatever secret she wished to protect is entombed along with it. He rose from the table, leaving his egg unfinished, an act so unprecedented that I nearly checked his temperature. "We go to Blackthorn Hall, Hastings. Today, now, before the earth has had time to settle." Blackthorn Hall sat at the end of a long drive flanked by beech trees whose bare November branches formed a canopy like the ribs of some vast Gothic cathedral. The house itself was Jacobean, red brick darkened by centuries, tall chimneys clustered like conspirators, and mullioned windows that caught the grey sky and gave back nothing. It was the sort of house that had seen births and deaths in equal measure, and regarded both with the same stony indifference. We arrived in the late afternoon, having driven from London in a hired car. Poirot had been silent for most of the journey, his eyes half closed, his fingertips pressed together in that attitude of concentration that I knew better than to interrupt. Only as we turned into the drive did he speak. "Observe the grounds, O Hastings. The gravel is freshly raked. Visitors have been expected. The curtains in the upper windows are drawn on the left but not the right. The family rooms are in mourning, but the guest wing is prepared. Someone anticipated arrivals after the funeral. The solicitor, perhaps. There'll be a will. There will indeed. And around a will, Hastings, there gathers a most interesting species of creature, the hopeful heir. Watch their faces. Watch their hands. The hands betray what the face conceals." We were admitted by a butler of the old school. Tall, silver-haired, with an expression suggesting he had been carved from the same stone as the house, and would stand long after everyone within it had turned to dust. His name, he informed us with the minimum of syllables, was Hargreaves. "Monsieur Poirot and Captain Hastings, the household has been informed of your arrival. If you will follow me to the drawing-room." The drawing-room was large, oak-panelled, and warmed by a fire that struggled against the chill seeping from the stone walls. Arranged around this fire, in various attitudes of grief, anxiety, and calculation, were the inhabitants and beneficiaries of Blackthorn Hall. The introductions were performed by a woman who stepped forward with the brisk authority of one accustomed to managing crises. She was perhaps 50, handsome in a severe fashion, with iron-grey hair pulled back, and the sort of posture that suggests a youth spent on horseback. "I am Natasha Gorin. The Countess was my aunt." Her English was precise, flavoured with the faintest Russian consonants. "You received her letter. She told me she had written it. I did not attempt to dissuade her. My aunt was not a woman who could be dissuaded." "You knew then, madame, that she believed herself to be poisoned?" A fractional pause. "I knew she believed it. I did not share the belief. My aunt was 81 years old, Monsieur Poirot. She had a heart condition. Dr. Morden was attentive and thorough. I saw no evidence of foul play. And yet you permitted the letter to be sent." "I permitted nothing. My aunt acted as she wished, always." Poirot inclined his head and turned his attention to the room. "I will describe the household as I found them that afternoon, for each would prove significant in the days that followed. First, there was Natasha's husband, Victor Gorin, a lean, dark man of perhaps 55, with the restless hands of a card player and the watchful eyes of a man who has spent his life calculating odds. He had been an officer in the White Army before the Revolution, and had married Natasha, by his own account, for love rather than her aunt's money, though the latter, I noted, had not been unwelcome. Second, there was the Countess's grandson, or rather, the grandson of the Count from his first marriage, a young man of 26 named Alexei Dobrynin. He was strikingly handsome in the Slavic manner, with fair hair and grey eyes, and a manner that oscillated between aristocratic languor and barely suppressed agitation. He had been living at Blackthorn Hall for the past year, ostensibly to keep the Countess company, though rumour, as I later learned, suggested he had been sent down from Cambridge and had nowhere else to go. Third, and most surprising, was an Englishwoman, Mrs. Lydia Phelps, a widow of perhaps 40 who served as the Countess's companion and secretary. She was a quiet creature, neat and self-contained, with the sort of face that is pleasant without being memorable. The kind of woman who enters a room without causing a stir and leaves it without being missed. Her eyes, however, were sharp, and they missed nothing. Fourth, there was Dr. Edwin Morden, the Countess's physician, a country doctor of the old school, red-faced, white-whiskered, with the comfortable manner of a man who regards death as a professional colleague rather than an adversary. He had attended the Countess for 7 years and had, he assured us, supervised her final decline with every resource at his disposal. And finally, standing apart from the others in a manner that suggested both belonging and exclusion, was a man I had not expected. Father Gregor Volkov, a Russian Orthodox priest in black cassock and cylindrical hat, who had performed the funeral service and who now remained, it seemed, as a sort of spiritual sentinel over the household. "The will is to be read tomorrow," Natasha informed us. "Mr. Pemberton, the solicitor, arrives from London in the morning. Until then, you are welcome to remain as guests." "I am most grateful, madame." Poirot's eyes had been moving from face to face with the quick, precise attention of a man cataloguing specimens. "Before we retire, however, I must ask a question that will seem, perhaps, indelicate. The Countess, where is she buried?" "In the churchyard of St. Michael's in the village, beside the Count." "The coffin, it was sealed before burial." Natasha's composure faltered, just slightly. "It was. Father Volkov supervised the preparation. My aunt's instructions were most specific." "And those instructions, they included the placement of certain items within the coffin?" The room went very still. I saw Victor's hands stop their restless movement. Alexei's grey eyes widened. Mrs. Phelps looked at her own shoes with sudden intensity. Only Father Volkov remained unmoved, his dark eyes fixed on Poirot with an expression I could not read. "She was buried with her icons," Natasha said carefully. "With a cross, with the things of the faith." "Nothing more." "Nothing more," Poirot repeated. "I see," he bowed. "Then I shall not detain you further tonight. Tomorrow, after the will is read, I shall have questions. Many questions. I ask only that no one leave Blackthorn Hall until I have asked them." It was not a request. It was delivered with the quiet authority of a man who understood that his presence transformed a house of mourning into a house of investigation, and that every person in that room knew it. Hargreaves showed us to our rooms in the guest wing. Mine was comfortable, if cold. Poirot's, to his visible distress, had a draught under the door that no arrangement of towels could entirely subdue. "Hastings," he said, standing at his window in his dressing gown, gazing out at the dark garden below. "The Countess knew she was being murdered. She wrote to me not for rescue but for revelation. She wants the coffin opened." "Why?" "Because of the key. The key to the strongbox. But a key may be left anywhere, in a desk drawer, with a solicitor, in a sealed envelope. Why sew it into the lining of a coffin that will be buried 6 feet underground?" I considered. "Because she wanted to make certain no one could get to it before you did." "Exactament. She hid the key in the one place none of her household could reach without committing an act so dramatic, so conspicuous, that it would constitute a confession." Poirot turned from the window. "The Countess was a very clever woman, Hastings. She set a trap, not for me, but for her murderer. The coffin is the bait. We must watch who tries to dig." Mr. Pemberton arrived the following morning with the punctuality and the demeanour of a solicitor for whom the reading of wills is less an occasion for grief than for the exercise of a comfortable profession. He was small, bald, and precise, with spectacles that magnified his eyes to an expression of perpetual, mild astonishment. The household assembled in the drawing-room. The fire had been stoked to a considerable blaze, yet the room remained cold, a cold that seemed to emanate not from the walls, but from the company. The will was, in its broad strokes, what one might expect. The bulk of the Countess's estate, Blackthorn Hall, the investments, the remaining Dobrynin jewels, was left to her nephew's wife, Natasha Gorin, as the closest living relative by marriage and the person who had managed the household for the past decade. But there were conditions. And it was the conditions that caused the room to shift, chairs to creak, and certain faces to assume expressions that would have been comical had they not been so nakedly revealing. First, the estate was to be administered by a trust, with Mrs. Lydia Phelps as co-trustee alongside the solicitor for a period of 5 years. Natasha would receive the income but could not sell the property or the jewels until the trust period expired. Second, Alexei Dobrynin was to receive an annual allowance of £300, generous enough for a young man of modest habits, but a fraction of what the estate could yield. The allowance would be paid only so long as Alexei remained in England and maintained, as the will put it, a manner of life that would not bring dishonor upon the family name. Third, and most remarkably, Father Volkov was to receive the contents of the chapel at Blackthorn Hall, the icons, the altar cloths, the gold-framed triptych that had been carried from the Crimea in 1918. Their value, Pemberton noted in an aside, was considerable. Fourth, Dr. Morden was bequeathed a sum of £1,000 in recognition of his devoted care and with the hope that he will continue to attend the household after my death. And finally, a codicil, added, Pemberton noted, only 3 weeks before the Countess's death. In the event that Monsieur Hercule Poirot determines that my death was not from natural causes, the trust is to be dissolved immediately, and the entire estate, including the jewels, is to be donated to the Russian Émigré Relief Fund in Paris. No member of this household is to receive 1 penny. The silence that followed was of the kind that has texture. It was thick, it was suffocating, and it pressed upon every person in the room with the weight of a revelation that changed everything. Victor Gorin was the first to speak. "This is outrageous." His voice was low, controlled, but the tendons in his neck stood out like cables. The old woman was mad. She was senile. This codicil, it's a weapon aimed at her own family. The Countess was examined by myself and by a Harley Street specialist in October, Dr. Morden said, his round face flushed. She was entirely of sound mind. Cantankerous, yes. Paranoid, perhaps, but legally competent. Paranoid, Natasha repeated. Yes, that is the word. She became convinced someone was poisoning her. She saw enemies everywhere. This letter to Monsieur Poirot, it is the product of an old woman's fears, nothing more. Poirot, who had listened to the reading with his head slightly tilted, like a bird detecting a frequency inaudible to others, now spoke. And yet, Madame, the codicil creates a most interesting situation. If I determine that the Countess died naturally, the will proceeds as written. You inherit, your husband benefits. Young Alexei receives his allowance. The priest keeps his icons, the doctor keeps his fee. But if I determine that she was murdered, he spread his hands. Everything goes to charity. No one in this room receives anything. Then it is in everyone's interest, Alexei said, with a bitter half-smile that made him look suddenly much older than 26, to ensure that you find nothing. On the contrary, Monsieur Dobrynin, it is in the murderer's interest that I find nothing. It is in every innocent person's interest that I find the truth, and quickly, for until I do, every one of you lives under suspicion, and suspicion, as any Russian should know, is a prison without walls. The will reading concluded with the strained formality of a dinner party at which someone has knocked over the wine. Pemberton gathered his papers, shook hands with insufficient conviction, and departed in his motor car with the air of a man who has dropped a grenade and is eager to be elsewhere before it detonates. Poirot wasted no time. He summoned each member of the household to the Countess's study, a small book-lined room at the rear of the house, and conducted his interviews with the relentless courtesy that made him, in my experience, more devastating than any Scotland Yard inspector. Dr. Morden came first. He was defensive, but thorough. The Countess suffered from angina pectoris and progressive cardiac weakness. I treated her with digitalis and rest. Her symptoms in the final weeks, nausea, fatigue, irregular heartbeat, confusion, were entirely consistent with her condition. I signed the death certificate without hesitation. And yet, doctor, the symptoms you describe are also consistent with arsenic poisoning. Morden flushed crimson. Arsenic. You can't simply... I can, doctor, and I do. The symptoms overlap almost perfectly. Nausea, weakness, confusion, cardiac disturbance. Without a toxicological examination, it would be impossible to distinguish the two. There was no toxicological examination because there was no reason for one. The woman was 81 with a documented heart condition, and a documented belief that she was being murdered. Morden's jaw worked. She was a difficult woman, Monsieur Poirot. Imperious, suspicious, given to imagining conspiracies. I attributed her fears to the cognitive decline that often accompanies cardiac disease. You did not test for poison. No. And now she is buried. Morden's silence was answer enough. Victor Gorin was next. He entered the study with the coiled energy of a man spoiling for confrontation, but Poirot diffused him with a question so unexpected that it knocked his anger sideways. Monsieur Gorin, tell me about the insurance. Victor blinked. Insurance. The Countess's jewels. They are insured, are they not? And the policy, it pays out to whom in the event of loss or theft? A pause. To the estate, which is to say, under the terms of the will, to the trust administered by Natasha and Mrs. Phelps. And the value? I am not certain. I think you are very certain, monsieur. The Dobrinin jewels were valued in 1932 at £40,000. The current valuation, I suspect, is considerably higher. Victor's eyes narrowed. What are you suggesting? I suggest nothing. I observe that a collection of jewels worth a fortune is held in a house where a woman has died under suspicious circumstances, and that the insurance policy creates a second motive beside the will, a motive that operates independently of the codicil. If the jewels were to disappear, the insurance would pay regardless of whether the death was natural or not. The jewels are in the household safe. They have not disappeared. Not yet, said Poirot. Not yet. Alexei Dobrinin was the most interesting interview and the most unsettling. The young man entered with the languid grace of one who has cultivated indifference as a form of armor, but beneath the veneer I sensed something desperate, the brittleness of a man living at the edge of some private abyss. 300 a year, he said, dropping into the chair opposite Poirot with theatrical weariness. Do you know what 300 a year means, monsieur? It means a bed-sitting room in Bayswater. It means boiled eggs and tinned sardines. It means the slow death of a Dobrinin, not by poison, but by mediocrity. You are disappointed by your inheritance. I am amused by it. My grandmother, step-grandmother technically, has left me enough to survive and not enough to live. A masterpiece of cruelty disguised as generosity. She was not your grandmother by blood then. The Count had me by his first wife, who died when I was 3. Irina married my grandfather when I was 10. She was good to me, in her way. She put me through school, paid my fees at Cambridge. But there was always a condition, always a price. She wanted a Dobrinin who would carry the name with dignity. I am, he gestured at himself with a self-mocking smile, not that Dobrinin. You were sent down from Cambridge. The smile hardened. Debts, cards, the usual aristocratic vices, adapted for the modern age. And the Countess was aware of this. She was aware of everything. That was her particular talent, knowing things and deploying that knowledge with surgical precision. Alexei, Poirot's voice softened. Did you love her? The question caught him off guard. The mask of sardonic indifference slipped, and beneath it I saw, for just a moment, something raw and complicated. Something that might have been grief, or guilt, or both. "She was the only person who ever believed I could be better than I am," he said, "which made her either the kindest person I have known or the most deluded. I'm not sure which. And her death, you accept that it was natural?" The mask returned. "I accept that she was old and ill, and that hearts give out. I accept that Monsieur Poirot must investigate because a letter has been written and a codicil has been drafted. And I accept that if you find evidence of murder, I lose my 300 a year along with everyone else." He rose. "Search where you wish, monsieur. I have nothing to hide that isn't already common knowledge." It was Mrs. Lydia Phelps who gave Poirot the key. Not the key in the coffin, but the key to understanding. She came to see him late that evening after the household had retired. I was reading in my room when Poirot's knock summoned me to his door. Mrs. Phelps stood in the corridor, a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her face pale but composed. "May I speak with you, Monsieur Poirot, in confidence?" "Always, madame. Hastings is my conscience. He stays." She sat in the chair by Poirot's fire and folded her hands in her lap with the precision of a woman accustomed to keeping herself small. "I've been the Countess's companion for 6 years, she began. "I managed her correspondence, kept her accounts, read to her in the evenings. She was not an easy woman, but she was honest, brutally so, and in a world of pretenders, I found that refreshing. You were fond of her. I was devoted to her, and I believe she was murdered." The words, spoken without drama, carried more conviction than any theatrical declaration could have. 3 months ago, Mrs. Phelps continued, the Countess asked me to purchase a quantity of litmus paper from a chemist in Aylesbury. She did not explain why. A week later, she asked me to test a sample of her evening tisane, the herbal drink she took before bed. She was specific. She wanted to know if the liquid was alkaline. And was it? More alkaline than it should have been. The Countess was not surprised. She asked me to say nothing to anyone and to continue testing the tisane each evening. Over the following weeks, the alkalinity fluctuated. Some nights it was normal. Others, it was elevated. The Countess kept a record. Where is this record? In the strongbox, under the study floor, along with other things. You know what is in the strongbox? I know what she told me. Letters, financial documents, and a diary she kept for the final 3 months of her life, in which she recorded her symptoms, the tisane test results, and her observations of the household. Poirot was very still. She knew who was poisoning her. She believed she knew. She told me the evening before she died. She said, "Lydia, I have loved the wrong people in the wrong way, and now one of them is killing me for it. When the Belgian comes, tell him to look at the hands. The hands never lie." "The hands," Poirot repeated softly. "Of whom?" Mrs. Phelps shook her head. She would not say. I think she could not bring herself to name them. Even at the end, she was protecting someone. Or testing them, Poirot murmured. "The coffin, madame. The key sewn into the lining. You know of this?" She asked me to do it. I sewed the key into the silk lining of the coffin myself, the night before the burial. Father Volkov was present. He did not approve, but the Countess insisted. "And no one else knows?" "No one, except the person who read the letter. The Countess made a copy, you see. She always made copies. If someone in this house read the copy before the original was posted to you, they would know about the key." Poirot's eyes blazed. "Where was the copy kept?" "In her writing desk, the desk in her bedroom. And the bedroom has been accessible to the household since her death. To everyone." Poirot rose. "Mrs. Phelps, you have been invaluable. Now I must ask you something that will require courage. I need the coffin opened. The legal process, the exhumation order. This takes time. But I believe time is something we do not have. If the murderer knows about the key, they may attempt to reach it first. You mean someone would dig up the grave? I mean that someone may have already tried. This was not idle speculation. When we visited St. Michael's churchyard the following morning, a grey, drizzling dawn, Poirot's suspicion was confirmed in the most dramatic fashion. The grave of the Countess Irina Dobrynyna, freshly mounded with earth and covered with dying wreaths, showed unmistakable signs of disturbance. The earth at the head end had been turned, not deeply, not enough to reach the coffin, but enough to indicate that someone had come in the night with a spade and attempted to dig. The sexton, a grizzled man of biblical age named Tompkins, confirmed that the grave had been undisturbed when he locked the churchyard gate at dusk the previous evening. "Someone came after dark," Poirot said, crouching beside the turned earth with that particular intensity he brought to physical evidence. "They began to dig, but stopped. Why? Because the task was too great for one person in one night, or because they were interrupted, or because they lost their nerve," I suggested. "Possible. But consider, Hastings, the person who attempted this knew about the key. They knew what was in the coffin, and they knew that once I found it, their crime would be exposed." He straightened up, brushing earth from his knees. "We cannot wait for legal process. Inspector Japp must be telephoned. An emergency exhumation order. I will use every connection I possess." It took 2 days. 2 days of telephone calls, telegrams, and the forceful deployment of Poirot's reputation upon the Home Office. 2 days during which the household at Blackthorn Hall existed in a state of suspended animation. Meals taken in silence, conversations conducted in whispers, and every face wearing the particular expressions of people who know they are being watched and cannot agree upon which expression appears most innocent. On the 3rd morning, the exhumation was carried out. A canvas screen was erected around the grave. Poirot, Inspector Japp, who had arrived from London with 2 sergeants and the weary air of a man whose weekend had been hijacked, the sexton, the coroner's officer, and I stood in the November drizzle as the coffin was raised from the earth. It was a handsome thing. Russian Orthodox tradition demanded it. Dark wood, brass fittings, an icon affixed to the lid. Father Volkov, who had insisted upon being present, murmured prayers in Church Slavonic as the lid was opened. The Countess lay within, dressed in white, her hands crossed over her breast. She looked, as the newly dead often do, both familiar and utterly alien. A sculpture of the woman she had been, with all the animation withdrawn. Around her were the icons, the cross, the small objects of faith that had accompanied her from Russia to England and now into the ground. Poirot leaned close. His hands, gloved, moved along the silk lining of the coffin. Pale blue silk, gathered and pleated in the traditional manner. His fingers traced the seams with the delicacy of a jeweler. "Here," he said. He produced a small pair of scissors and, with surgical precision, cut 3 stitches in the lining near the Countess's left shoulder. From the opening, he withdrew a small brass key, tarnished but intact. Japp whistled softly. "She planned this. The whole thing. She planned this, Inspector, because she knew that her death would be declared natural, her murderer would go unpunished, and her secrets would be buried with her, unless someone came looking." Poirot held the key up to the grey sky. "She chose me to come looking. She chose well. But there was something else in the coffin that the Countess had not planned. Poirot noticed it because Poirot noticed everything. Tucked beneath the Countess's folded hands, partially hidden by the silver cross, was a small twist of paper. A note written in haste, in a handwriting that was emphatically not the Countess's. Poirot extracted it with tweezers. The note read, "Forgive me. I had no choice." The study at Blackthorn Hall was a room that had absorbed its owner's character so completely that entering it felt like entering a conversation with the dead. Every surface bore the Countess's stamp. The heavy Russian candlesticks on the mantelpiece, the faded photograph of Count Piotr in Cossack uniform, the shelf of French novels and Russian poetry, and the icon of the Virgin that hung beside the window, its gold leaf catching the thin November light. Poirot went directly to the carpet. With Japp's assistance, we moved the desk, a substantial piece that required considerable effort, and lifted the section of floor beneath it. The boards had been cut and refitted with hinges concealed beneath the carpet. A trapdoor, invisible unless one knew precisely where to look. Below it, in a shallow cavity lined with brick, sat a steel strong-box. Poirot inserted the key from the coffin. It turned with a sound like a sigh. The contents were arranged with the same meticulous precision that had characterized the Countess in life. Poirot removed them one by one, laying each item upon the desk with the reverence of an archaeologist cataloguing relics. First, a leather-bound diary filled with the Countess's strong handwriting. The entries spanned 3 months. Second, a sheaf of letters bound with ribbon written in Russian. Third, a set of financial documents, bank statements, transfer records, receipts. Fourth, a small glass vial, stoppered and sealed with wax, containing a pale residue. And fifth, a photograph. Old, creased, showing 2 women standing before a grand building in what appeared to be St. Petersburg. One was recognizably a young Countess Irina. The other, younger, darker, with a face of haunting beauty, bore a resemblance to someone I'd seen recently, though I could not immediately place it. Poirot studied the photograph for a long time. Then he turned it over. On the back, in faded ink, was written, Irina and Katya, 1907, the Nevsky, before everything changed. Katya, Poirot murmured. He looked at me, and in his eyes was that expression of terrible clarity that meant the grey cells had reached their conclusion, a conclusion that gave him no pleasure. Hastings, summon the household, all of them, in 1 hour in this room. You know who did it? I have known since Mrs. Phelps spoke of the hands, but knowledge is not proof. The diary, he placed his palm upon the leather cover. The diary is proof, and the vial, that is the final piece. He opened the diary and began to read. I watched his face as he turned the pages. His expression moved through stages, concentration, recognition, sadness, and finally, a cold, hard anger that sat upon his features like frost upon a window pane. When he finished, he closed the diary and placed it precisely in the center of the desk. The Countess was a very brave woman, Hastings. She sat in this house for 3 months, watching herself being murdered by degrees, and she recorded everything. Every dose, every symptom, every observation. She was building a case. The case she would not live to present. She has given it to me instead. And the note in the coffin? Forgive me, I had no choice. The note was placed there after the funeral preparation, after Mrs. Phelps sewed in the key, by the only person who had access to the coffin before it was sealed, Father Volkov. Father Volkov, who was present throughout, who blessed the coffin, who was the last person to touch it before the lid was closed. Then the priest is the murderer? Poirot shook his head slowly. The priest is not the murderer, Hastings. The priest is the confessor. Someone confessed to him, confessed the murder, and asked him to place that note in the coffin as an act of contrition. Father Volkov, bound by the seal of confession, could not refuse, could not reveal what he had been told, but he could place that note, that small, desperate plea for forgiveness, where only the dead woman could receive it. Then who confessed? The person who is about to confess again, Poirot said. To me. They gathered in the study at 4 o'clock, as the November light was already dying. Poirot had asked Hargreaves to light the candles on the mantelpiece, an atmospheric touch that I suspected was not accidental. The candlelight threw long shadows across the faces of the household, lending each the aspect of a portrait in which the sitter's secrets are barely concealed by the painter's art. Natasha and Victor sat together on the settee. Alexei stood by the window, his arms folded. Mrs. Phelps occupied the straight-backed chair near the desk, her hands folded in her lap. Dr. Morden stood by the fire, his whiskers catching the light. Father Volkov, tall, dark, motionless, occupied the corner nearest the icon, as though drawing strength from its presence. Inspector Japp stood by the door, notebook ready. Poirot stood behind the desk, the strong box open before him, the diary at his hand. Mesdames, Messieurs, Father, he inclined his head to each in turn. You are here because the Countess Irina Dobrinina asked me to discover the truth about her death. I have done so. The truth is contained in this diary, in these documents, and in the small glass vial that the Countess preserved as evidence. I have had the vial's contents analyzed by a chemist in Aylesbury. The residue is antimony, specifically tartar emetic, a poison that, administered in small doses over weeks, produces symptoms indistinguishable from progressive cardiac failure. Dr. Morden made a strangled sound. Antimony. But The symptoms deceived you, Doctor, because they were designed to deceive you. The murderer chose the poison precisely because it would mimic the Countess's existing condition. You are not to blame for failing to detect what was calculated to be undetectable. Poirot opened the diary. The Countess's own words. She writes on the 15th of September. The nausea returned tonight after the tisane. Lydia's test showed elevated alkalinity. The pattern is clear. The poison is administered in the evening drink, but not every evening. The intervals are calculated to allow partial recovery, thereby disguising the cumulative effect. She continues on the 22nd of September. I watched the hands tonight. The left hand holds the cup, the right hand stirs, but it is what the right hand does before it stirs that interests me. A movement too quick, too practiced. The right hand passes over the cup and drops something, a pinch, a grain, and the stirring conceals the dissolution. She writes. Poirot's voice grew very quiet. I know now who is killing me. I've always known. I simply refuse to see. The room was absolutely silent. The candles on the mantelpiece had burned low, and the shadows had grown longer. She writes on the 3rd of October. I have prepared my letter to Monsieur Poirot. I have prepared the strong-box. I have sewn the key. If he comes, the truth will emerge. If he does not, then I die a foolish old woman who trusted too much and suspected too late. Poirot closed the diary. She died on the 8th of November. She was buried on the 12th. I received her letter on the 13th. She gave me every advantage she could, and she asked only one thing in return, that I watch the hands. He looked up. His gaze moved with deliberate slowness from face to face. Victor's rigid stare, Natasha's controlled composure, Alexei's brittle mask, Mrs. Phelps' quiet watchfulness, Dr. Morden's flushed distress, Father Volkov's dark stillness. And then Poirot's gaze settled. The tisane was prepared each evening by the same person. The Countess's diary confirms this. Night after night, for 3 months, the tisane was brought to the Countess's bedroom and placed on her nightstand. The right hand held the spoon, the left hand held the cup. And between the holding and the stirring, the right hand dropped its cargo. Antimony, in doses small enough to evade detection but cumulative enough to kill. He paused. The person who prepared the tisane, who stirred it, who sat beside the Countess each evening and watched her drink, was the person she trusted most completely. The person to whom she had given the management of her household, the co-trusteeship of her estate, and 6 years of companionship. Every eye in the room turned to Lydia Phelps. Mrs. Phelps sat very still. She did not protest. She did not weep. She looked at Poirot with an expression that was, and this is the only word that will serve, resigned. The Countess wrote in her diary, Poirot continued, his voice now infinitely gentle, "Lydia's hands are the steadiest I've known. They never tremble, not when she pours, not when she reads, not when she lies. It is the steadiness that convicted her, for no innocent hand is so perfectly controlled." She knew, Mrs. Phelps said. Her voice was flat, emptied of everything but fact. She knew for weeks, and she let me continue. She let you continue because she needed the evidence. The vial, the residue she scraped from the bottom of the cup. That was her proof. Without it, the diary is merely an old woman's suspicion. With it, there is no doubt. Why? The word came from Natasha, not as an accusation, but as a genuine cry of bewilderment. Lydia, why? She gave you everything. A home, a position, her trust. Mrs. Phelps turned to face her. And now, finally, something broke behind those careful eyes. Not grief, not remorse, but a fury that had been banked for years and could no longer be contained. She gave me nothing, Mrs. Phelps said. She gave me the privilege of servitude. She gave me the honor of fetching and carrying for a woman who treated kindness as a form of ownership. Do you know what it is to be a companion, Mrs. Gorin? It is to be present always and invisible always. To be needed but never valued. To be trusted with every secret and rewarded with condescension. She stood. Her composure was gone now, replaced by something I found genuinely frightening. The cold, articulate rage of a woman who has been humiliated for so long that hatred has become as natural as breathing. She made me co-trustee, a leash, 5 years of managing her estate for the benefit of people I despise, while I receive a salary and a room and the perpetual reminder that I am not family, not Russian, not one of them. 5 years of being Lydia, useful, invisible, essential, and utterly expendable. And so you killed her, Poirot said. I freed myself. She would have died within the year regardless. Morden said as much. I simply accelerated the process. Accelerated it by 3 months of sustained poisoning, by watching a woman you professed to serve die slowly by your hand, by sitting at her bedside and stirring antimony into her evening drink, while she looked at you with the eyes of one who knows and says nothing. Poirot's voice had hardened to steel. That is not freedom, madame. That is murder in its coldest, most deliberate form. And the note in the coffin, Japp said from the doorway. That was yours too? Mrs. Phelps closed her eyes. I confessed to Father Volkov the night before the burial. I asked him to place the note. It was an impulse, a weakness. I thought perhaps if she could forgive me from wherever she had gone, it would... She stopped. Whatever she had hoped forgiveness would provide, the words would not come. Father Volkov spoke for the first time. His voice was deep, accented, heavy with something that might have been sorrow, or might have been the accumulated weight of too many confessions. I placed the note as she asked. The seal of confession bound me. I could not speak. But I prayed, Monsieur Poirot. I prayed that someone would find the truth. Someone did, Poirot said. The Countess herself. From beyond the grave, through a letter, a key, a diary, and a vial of poison that she preserved at the cost of her own comfort and safety. She could have stopped the poisoning at any time by dismissing Mrs. Phelps. She chose instead to gather evidence, to build a case that no court could dismiss, no solicitor could undermine, no murderer could escape. He looked at Mrs. Phelps with an expression I had rarely seen on his face. Not anger, not triumph, but a profound and weary pity. She gave you 6 years, madame. She gave you her trust, her secrets, her companionship, and in return you gave her a slow death and a note that said, "Forgive me." I do not think forgiveness is so cheaply bought, Inspector Japp stepped forward. "Mrs. Lydia Phelps, I'm arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Countess Irina Dobrynyina." "You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say." She went quietly. She went as she had lived in that house. Without drama, without noise, with the terrible composure of a woman who had learned to make herself invisible and now found that invisibility was, at last, impossible. 2 days later, Poirot and I stood beside the Countess's grave in St. Michael's churchyard. The earth had been replaced, the wreaths renewed. A pale winter sun struggled through the clouds, illuminating the headstone with its Cyrillic inscription. "She was extraordinary," I said. She was Hastings. A woman who stared into the face of her own murder and did not flinch, who sat each evening and drank her poison tisane and recorded the evidence that would convict her killer, knowing that each sip brought her closer to death. Why didn't she simply dismiss Mrs. Phelps? Go to the police? Tell you sooner. Poirot was silent for a moment, because she wanted to be certain. The Countess was a woman of absolute standards. She would not accuse without proof. She would not destroy a life, even the life of her murderer, on suspicion alone. And because... He paused, and I thought I saw something glisten at the corner of his eye, though it might have been the cold wind. Because she understood, I think, what drove Mrs. Phelps to do it. She understood the corrosion of servitude, the slow poison of dependence. She had been a refugee herself. She knew what it was to be stripped of everything and forced to live at the pleasure of others. "You're saying she pitied her?" "I'm saying she comprehended her. It is not the same as pity, and it is not the same as forgiveness, but it is, perhaps, the reason she allowed the murder to proceed. Not from weakness, but from a desire that the truth should be complete. That the diary should record not merely the crime, but the motive. That when Hercule Poirot came, as she trusted he would understand not only what had happened, but why." He laid his hand briefly upon the headstone. The gesture was so unlike Poirot, so uncharacteristic in its tenderness, that I looked away, feeling I had witnessed something private. "The codicil," I said after a moment, to fill the silence. "With Mrs. Phelps convicted, the will proceeds. Natasha inherits. Natasha inherits. Alexei receives his allowance. Father Volkov keeps his icons. The world continues as the Countess designed it. And the jewels? The jewels remain in the safe. Victor Gorin, I note, seemed particularly relieved by this outcome. Poirot's mustaches twitched. He had been calculating their value, I think, since the moment the coffin was closed. Some men are so. They mourn with one eye and count with the other. We walked back through the churchyard gate. The village lay quiet in the winter light. Stone cottages, a post office, a pub called the King's Head, an England that had absorbed tragedy and cruelty and madness for centuries and emerged each morning looking precisely the same. "One thing puzzles me still," I said. "The attempt to dig up the grave. Who was that?" Poirot smiled. "Ah, the digging. That was Alexei. The young man is in debt. Considerably more than £300 a year will remedy." He had read the copy of the Countess's letter, which Mrs. Phelps had carelessly left in the writing desk. He knew about the key. He knew about the strongbox, and he calculated, correctly, as it happens, that the strongbox might contain information that could be leveraged for money. Blackmail. The young man has his grandfather's blood, the blood of gamblers and risk-takers. He thought the strongbox might contain something worth selling. He was wrong, of course. It contained only the truth, and the truth, Hastings, is the one commodity that no market can properly value. We climbed into the hired car. The engine turned over with a cough and a wheeze, and we pulled away from Blackthorn Hall for the last time. "Poirot," I said as we reached the main road. "The Countess's letter. She said she knew who was poisoning her and that it was someone she loved. Did she love Mrs. Phelps?" Poirot was quiet for a long time. The Chiltern Hills rolled past, bare and beautiful in their winter austerity. At last he spoke. The Countess was a woman who had lost everything: her country, her husband, her youth. What remained to her was her household, her pride, and the small circle of people upon whom she had bestowed her trust. Mrs. Phelps was within that circle, not as family, not as friend, but as something rarer, a daily presence. Someone who was always there. The Countess depended upon her, and for a woman of Irina Dobrinina's fierce independence, dependence was the closest thing to love she could permit herself. He adjusted his scarf against the cold. That is the tragedy, Hastings. Not that Mrs. Phelps killed her, but that the Countess understood why and forgave her for it before the act was complete. The note in the coffin asked for forgiveness. The Countess, I think, had already given it. She merely wished the truth to survive her generosity. I drove in silence after that, navigating the narrow lanes with more care than usual, not because the road required it, but because the story required its own kind of quiet. At the border of London, as the fields gave way to suburbs and the sky turned the colour of old pewter, Poirot spoke once more. "The little grey cells, Hastings, they are satisfied. The case is closed. The murderer is taken. The evidence is complete. And yet," he sighed, a sound I'd heard perhaps 5 times in all our years, "and yet I find myself wishing that the Countess had chosen a less courageous path, that she had dismissed Mrs. Phelps, called the police, lived out her remaining months in safety. The world would have been poorer for the loss of her diary, but richer for the continuation of her life. She wouldn't have seen it that way. No. She was Russian, Hastings. The Russians, they do not compromise with fate. They meet it full in the face, with a candle in one hand and a glass of vodka in the other, and they say, 'Do your worst.' It is magnificent. It is also, on occasion, fatal." He fell silent. The London traffic swallowed us. The evening came down, and with it the 1,000 lights of a city that did not know and would not care that an old Russian woman had faced her murderer across a cup of poisoned tea and chosen, with a courage that breaks the heart, to let the truth speak for itself. "Home, Poirot," I said. "Home, Hastings, where the tisane is made by my own hand and the moustaches are in order, and no one, I trust, has poisoned the evening meal." "You trust?" His eyes twinkled. "I verify, mon ami. Always I verify. It is the secret of long life and excellent digestion." I laughed, and the sound, warm, human, absurdly normal, seemed for a moment to hold the darkness at bay.